Hello everyone, this is Andrew Weston, back and ready for more for Space Discoveries 3. In episode 3, we begin at communication lines to higher levels of a deeper look in communications of the Merkaba of design. Stay tuned. As we go into the digital clocking, the connections of the genetics and patterns, we surface its track lines. This opens all communications and modification, the synergies and the communication line streams and abstractions. The generics and calculations lines of GOD, mechanisms, high travels, sets lines of provisions. It sequences correlation setting and attractions. Now the connections all levels of the binaries of the code setting is putting everything back in zero attraction. This modifies your line signals. Now the modulators and high calculation of the streams. The subconscious of water of its path indicates high position geometric lines of patterns. This opens all communication lines of high track location. As we come into the attractions, the water surfaces hires and track to its communication. The subconscious line communication of scanning high positions all levels. The open sequence on high position all calculations puts all graphing calculated lines and high interferes with graphical screens. It directs lines of DNA track lines, the binary reset position of its programs. The Aeronix lines calculation high centers, high position locations, simplifies the calculation streams. Now high position all levels. Data streams inside location. As we come into the conscious line communications, all lines, electrical line and high calculations of its circuits, high panels its circuits, and high rotation centers. As we come into higher lines of self-activation, the streaming divisions opens all signals of patterns. It modifies all calculations with streaming, directing lines of communication. And it's high generating high lines of communication and high forces its line streams as it comes into waving patterns. Coming into the oversoul, the computer of its programming relines, calculates, and regenerates the screen settings. It sums all signals, all communications back encoding. The calculation lines of the data operation highways and sets lines of communication lines to high neural levels of programs and high calculations. The directions all levels of the sim is the simulation identifications of moderation. This comes into all calculations and reprogramming. This programs all calculation lines of the spherical spheres of set locations back in traction. Sending all communications, all levels of the Earth line connections. Getting into the reactor of source, the dome centers and high track lines changes measures. Now this correlates the clock line center's high position of zero gravity. So it tracks its communication lines of counterclockwise and high positions. The counter measures and high position of track lines opens all communication settings to all calculation. Directing all levels of modification. As the Merkaba restores and high calculation of its energy, the retract lines of the computer frames resets lines divisions. Now counterclockwise the high calculation lines of clockings. Now the mechanism high position of power lines at generation line screens opens all levels of atomic lines of connection high systems to track location. This directs the signals and panels of communication. As we come into the rotors and line calculation setting, the rotation lines of crystals, the box screen changes geographic lines of visionary cortex lines of colorations of paths. Now directing line state location of its highways, it resurfaces track lines. This is where it puts up the isolations lines of calculation stream lines and high calculation. Directing lines of all communications in four strangles. Directing lines of box lines of visionary cortex location. As the communication lines, the atom has to be an equivalent line center. This core regenerates the system to its calculations, reversing the cycle of high calculation line centers. Now we have polarities and line position on plasma line generation screen lines. Lacing lines of communication reinforces high attractions and high positions calculations. This resets positions at levels of its Merkaba location. As the Merkaba is resetting its patterns, the calculation line stream interference is vortexing line settings. The polarities come into high calculating lines. Now this circulates and rotates the centers of its communication setting up new plasma line screens in high position for its operation, directing lines of all communications of pathing lines of mapping sequence. As the theoretical spheres are vortexing, the connection line centers high calculation that travels light is redirecting panels. Now this is our vortex lines of calculation lines. It sets up all communications of discords in high calculation streams. This directs the signals and path of total line calculation stream locations of attraction. As we surface in the cosmic atmosphere and the communication of the sunrise, the vortex stream interference comes in awaiting panels. Now as the galaxy shift lines in high position of coloration, it changes lines of anomalies in high centers of track location. It sets lines of all communications and colorations of calculation lines as we come into the waveline centers of track location. As we surface in the higher communication lines of the solar lines, we have a start recognition of time sequence that puts visionary cortex lines of travel. Now, directing lines of communication line center has a star lines of a duster clouding that tracks its communication lines of lacing lines of mapping sequence. This calculates and modifies of line maps of travel calculation. This puts you into digital lines of communication frames and high calculation all levels of its computer. The computer aligns its communication lines of detection. Now this highlights the streams. The vortex line communication has digital layers. The directives communication lines have pathical line centers of travels that directs the signals in set position to its calculations. As we come into the map codes as spherical spheres of numbers, tracking lines of point systems, now we have a correlation high interference to direct and redirect signals. This opens all communications to its line settings. As we come into the gateways of configuration, setting track lines and colorations of paths opens all calculation line settings. And this clocks its division location of plasma converters and set location of travel. This directs the signals in set position. High travel into high calculation lines, we come into all calculation of scanning. Now the signals and position locations, we come into reconfiguration line calculation. This regenerates the high streams and high calculated line streams, directing lines of recoding of line setting of all point system location. As we set a line communication of its energy line, the circuits of the restoration line screens highest position of its travels. This is reposition locations to its mind line setting. This opens all tracks of communication of its cloud. This also resets positions to its all restorations of communication, putting line channels in calculation. This also comes into all calculation line setting. Now the digital base aligns its calculation to its restore. That restores its line setting to all calculation to its graphical set location. This puts all track lines of the Merkaba and its tesseract of its tetrahedron set position line connections as the serial rays of Ascension come into high center. Coming into the mapping equations of operation line screens, we set repositions all levels. This retracts line calculation lines of AI calculation streams. The circuits of reloading sets lines of graphical calculation lines of rain graph screens and all calculation line streams in high centered positions to its application of codes. This patterns lines its divisions to its spherical line communication box centers of track location. As we come into line communication of screen lines vision, the adaptation comes back in center. Center lines its communication lines at graphical calculation line positions of box frequencies up to reception. Coming in line calculating line centers of the surface, the waves of the particles reset positions in triangulation, restoring all communication lines of lacing communications of energetic ground lines and high position of travels in direction of time sequence. Puts all communication lines back into the mind of awareness of its gateway system. As we send line communication, we start racing through the tunnels. Tunnels come into force line streams. high calculated modified, coming into the spheric atmospheres and high travels, putting all centers in high position attractions back in division. As we enter lines of communication to the interdimensional lines of vortex locations, this puts high generation lines back in settings. As we set position location of light and high calculated lines of divisional line streams and position locations to all calculation setting, the nebula line connection of star lines, high position track lines, into configuration of face recognition. Coming into all levels of consciousness, of space and its connections.
This is Space Discoveries 3. Stay tuned for more.